Fortunate to have Gretchen with us today. She was featured also in the social justice class that Kim Siegel had, and I think Irene, you heard that episode here. So anyway, that's a beautiful story, and I think it's online when you talk about your journey. She started off as a school teacher, middle school.
Yes.
And you did that for 10 years, and then you became a lawyer and specializing in family practice, family law, and also immigration law. And you told that story in the movie. And not only that, but she was selected as a superstar, right? That was it. So she's a superstar lawyer, Rising Stars, for 2018, and only 2 lawyers per state are selected. So the U.S. has done something really special to do that.
Trying to keep that kind of quiet. So
Oh,
don't
well,
tell anyone out of the
if you
room.
Google it, it's there. Let me just put this in. So anyway.
I can do it. Oh, not this one.
No, it doesn't seem to work.
I just it has chocolate test.
This one works so great. Okay, so Gretchen, I think that if you, the students here, who are about 23, are all in the global development major, by and large. By and large, most of them. And they're mostly seniors, sophomore and junior, and they're thinking about global development. But they have a lot of different backgrounds, and it's a wide tent. So maybe all of them will go into law after they hear what you do, because they really could do that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mary, for inviting me to join you today. I love coming to SPU. SPU is one of my favorite places, not just because my husband is here, but also just because I have been able to come to campus on a handful of occasions to talk about immigration law, and I've just always been impressed with the students whom I've met and the conversations I've had. So it's great to be here. It's early, so I'm glad to see you have coffee. I do too. But I have a sort of overview of refugees and asylees. I was thinking that I would just talk with you more generally about what it means to be a refugee and what it means to be an asylee. And that's because of some of the topics that Mary had asked for me to cover, but also it's because this is something that we hear about all the time right now in the news, and with even today and yesterday with some of the negotiations that are happening with reopening the government. Some of those negotiations are, let's talk about numbers, let's talk about how many refugees we allow, and how are asylees granted asylum, who should be considered, that sort of thing. So hopefully it's very timely.
And there were 6 lawsuits that were being reported on NPR yesterday.
Oh.
Their federal lawsuits have been filed.
Yes. So, and that is my hope that you'll take that little takeaway from this conversation that we have today too, is that in this kind of the last 2 years or so of our experience here with this administration, one thing that we have learned is that the lawsuits really have kept the administration in check. And so, starting with the travel ban, I was here talking with some of you shortly after that travel ban was put into effect, and we saw the Attorney General immediately file a lawsuit, and Washington State was at the forefront of why those travel bans were eventually withdrawn and found unlawful. So if you are interested in law, it's a very exciting time to be involved, especially in immigration law, because we see that the courts are consistently holding both the the administration, and not as much yet, but we'll see maybe even Congress in check with the legislation that is adopted. So that's kind of the background. I was a teacher for 10 years, and so this is my second career. I think that we all have a long life ahead of us, hopefully, and so you have the opportunity to do lots of different things. I'm very grateful that I was a teacher before going to law school. I think that it gave me the opportunity to work with students, and now most of my practice focuses on youth, and so I don't know that I would have had the same perspective that I have now had I not had 10 years in the classroom. I worked with kids with learning disabilities, so it was a great backdrop to my current practice. So I know if you're a senior, you may be feeling anxious about what's next. It's probably just one little step in a long road of what's next. So be excited about it. So I'm going to put my lawyer hat on and just, this is a quote, I've shared it before, but the president of the National Association of Immigration Judges, she shared this quote. This is something that she had said to the House of Congress, or the representatives, when she was talking about, her arguments about why special attention and detail should be provided to those who are seeking immigration relief. And the quote, I'll just let you read it, but as we'll talk about in just a little bit, an immigration hearing that determines the fate of an individual and their ability to remain in the United States is about 7 minutes long. And so if somebody is here asking for asylum, their entire opportunity to make that request sometimes is pared down to 7 minutes. So the stakes are high. And oftentimes folks are asked to make a claim very, very quickly after entering the United States, and so may not even have the ability to articulate their claim or their experience. As some of you, I'm sure you understand, people who have been victims of violence or trauma, sometimes it takes years to be able to articulate exactly what that trauma was. So to have to articulate that clearly immediately at the border, and then be able to meet all of the criteria, the legal criteria for being eligible for asylum, and then articulating that to a judge in a language that's not your own is incredibly difficult. So this was just a plea from the former president that this is a very complicated process, and we're not giving people the time and the process that they deserve. And that's, just from a legal standpoint, this is also one of the issues that arose with the family separation. So you probably all heard in 2018 about the family separation issues, and one of those was just a very simple due process of just a very basic legal theory that was being violated. I'm going to just take one step back. So I try really hard to not kind of be overly political when I share immigration laws and talk about immigration laws. But, Congress wrote these laws, and our administration, the executive branch, implements the laws. And so it is so hard to separate the two, to separate politics from immigration. So as much as I'm going to try to walk carefully on that line, because I understand that we all have very different political ideas and experiences and beliefs, and I do think that people can come together and have a conversation from all over the board on that. But I'm going to share sort of what has been happening to the immigrant. And these are the people who I work with, and so that's the perspective that I'll share. And as much as it has to be embedded in political language, sometimes it just is. But feel free to push back. I'm a lawyer. I like conflict, so don't be shy if you want to throw out another perspective. That's very welcome here. Okay, so moving on to just different paths to the United States. So there are 4 basic avenues for an immigrant visa. So there are lots of visas. There are like tourist visas, student visas, and those are all temporary visas. But to live here permanently in the United States, you must have what's called a lawful permanent resident status. And that is, we call that a green card. And there are 4 sort of basic ways to get to the United States. One is the family-based visas, and that's if your parent or sibling has a green card or is a U.S. citizen, that person can apply for you. Interestingly, there is no grandparent visa, there's no cousin visa, there's no aunt or uncle visa. So you have to be immediate relative, spouse, parent, child, in order for someone to petition for you. The second avenue is an employment-based visas, and those visas are sometimes pathways to green cards, but not always. But most of the time they are. And then refugees. Refugees are eligible for a green card 1 year after entry. And then diversity visas. Those are visas that it's the lottery. I call it the lottery because if your country of origin, your home country, is an underrepresented country in the United States, then historically the Department of State will literally pull numbers out of a computer system, and if your number comes up, you get a green card, and it's a lottery. So the idea is to foster diversity in our country, which again,
What countries are underrepresented typically?
There's a long list and it's ever changing, so I can't just rattle them off the top of my head, but I can tell you that countries that are not on the list are countries where it's called oversubscribed. So right now for the family-based visas, I'll show you in a moment, we have a visa bulletin, and there are certain countries where there are so many family members coming to live with their family members, to be reunited with their family, that those countries are oversubscribed and the wait is 10 to 15 years. And those countries are China, India, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras. Those are countries that are considered oversubscribed because we have so many people here. The Philippines, where there are already families established that they're not, they don't qualify under the diversity visa. There are requirements for the diversity visa. One requirement, which is just interesting, is that a high school education, a diploma is required. So that is something that, so you can't, a child, for example, couldn't apply for a diversity visa. Okay. Anyone have questions about that? Sometimes I like to go through this exercise. Sometimes I go to classrooms with my son is in 5th grade, and I've been to his classroom and other elementary school classrooms, and I tell them, okay, you've got 500,000 visas, you get to decide who gets those green cards and divvy them up among these 4 categories by percentages. That's what Congress did. Essentially, our voted representatives, that they in the 80s, a long time ago, that's what they did, is they divvied up these numbers. But it really shows where our values are, right? Honestly, even that there was a diversity visa, that's a value, is great. And our current administration is trying to get rid of that visa. That's one of the visas that's on the chopping block, is the diversity visa, which I just think is a reflection of kind of our values. So in your mind, you can sort of mentally go through that exercise. We won't take the time to do it, but you can think about, Congress has allotted X number of visas. How would you, if you were our senator, how would you divide those up? Did you have a question?
No, yeah, I mean, what about families when they get like visa, like they have kids, so they still are the ones who apply, but they have a child, so they can still bring them. So at the end of the day, I guess high school diploma requirement is not.
Good question. So we do there's a portion of the immigration law that allows for we call them derivatives of the applicant to follow to join, basically. So if your parent, for example, won the diversity lottery, got a visa, then your parent, and that's your parent's spouse, and all of the minor children would be able to join on that visa. So that means that any siblings over 21 would be left behind. But you and anyone else under 21 or everybody else would get to come. Okay. That's true for all 4 areas, actually. Yeah. Oh, yes, sorry.
Do the families themselves pay for all of this, or do they get funding?
There is no funding there's no funding for any part of this process. Although there may be some funding for the refugees. That process, we'll talk about that, begins abroad. So it's not a process. I can't even get involved in that process because I'm physically in the United States. So the designation in that process begins abroad. I believe there is funding for the refugee process. And then we have great organizations like World Relief, but those organizations are nonprofits for the purpose of supporting. The government doesn't allot funding or anything. So these are all self-funded. And in fact, it's interesting because with the exception of the refugee, so the family-based, in particular, the family-based visa, in order for a family member to come to the United States, whomever's petitioned for that family member, so that parent, for example, if a parent was petitioning for a child, that parent would have to show that they have enough resources to keep that child and whomever else is coming above the poverty line. And that is that's actually a pretty big barrier for a lot of people, because if you imagine a family of 5, and now they're essentially adding maybe another family of 5 to their household, even though they may all not live together. So you've gone from 5 to 10, and the poverty line for 10 is still maybe $60,000. And so somebody needs to show that they have an annual income at or above that in order to be able to sponsor all of those people. So there are certainly financial barriers, but there's no funding. That's the long answer to that.
What would it take to change the number, either up or down?
Congress, except for the refugees, we'll talk about that. The administration has the ability to change that number.
Administration.
Mm-hmm.
Not Congress.
The executive branch may, through an executive order, change the number of refugees who are permitted into the United States. And that is, the executive order may be based on, some lawful, there has to be some lawful reason. But I will talk about those numbers. So here's just an example. We'll do this quickly, but this is the visa bulletin from last November, so it's a couple months old. This is updated every month. Right now, the February bulletin's already out. So remember how I said that family-based visas, you can apply for a family member. So F1 is, I'm just going to tell you what these categories are. So F1 is unmarried sons and daughters of U.S. citizens. So a son and daughter is somebody who's over 21. Because immediate relatives are children who are under 21. So this is someone who's a son or daughter who's over the age of 21, but not married. F2, these are for lawful permanent residents, the F2A and B. So those are green card holders, not U.S. citizens. The 2A is for spouses and children, and 2B is for unmarried sons and daughters. So the interesting thing about this is that F2A, if you are a green card holder, then you don't automatically get to bring your spouse or children to the United States with you. You have to wait in line. They have to wait in line. But if you're a U.S. citizen, automatically your spouse and children are permitted. Their visas, it's called immediately available. You don't have to wait in line. There's not a number cap to it. So F3 are married sons and daughters of U.S. citizens. So if you look at F1 versus F3, if you're 22, your parent is a U.S. citizen, and you decide to get married, you've just added 5 years to your wait to come to the U.S. So sometimes those folks have to, love doesn't win. And then F4 is brothers and sisters of adult U.S. citizens. So you have to be 21 in order to petition for anybody. And this is why that, the whole issue with DACA, kids who are born in the United States. So kids who are born in the United States, and if their parents don't have status, they can't do anything to help keep their family together until they turn 21. So that's a long wait for people to kind of live in the shadows. But I'm just going to give you one example. If you are, according to this visa bulletin, if you have a green card, you guys have to figure this out, okay? If you have a green card and you are born in Mexico, that's your home country, but you have a green card in the United States, and you'd like to petition for your son who's 21, how long will that take? 2 years. So F2 is for green card holders, and then F2B is for sons and daughters. So how long will that take if you want to petition for your 21-year-old son to come live with you in the U.S.? Anybody do the math?
5 years?
Nope. Longer than that.
This is for the F2A, is that right?
F2B.
F2B, the unmarried.
Unmarried, yep.
10 years.
So,
Nope.
Is it 15?
So so for Mexico, this is how you read this. For Mexico, you needed to have, 1997. So you needed to have applied for the visa in 1997 in order for the visa to be current today, in November.
21 years.
So you would have to wait 21 years. So if you were to apply today for your son in Mexico, then you would have to wait, 21 years in order before that visa would become current so that your son could join you. So your son would be 42.
And does he still have to be unmarried?
And he still has to be unmarried.
Ludicrous.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So here's one more. No, sorry, I didn't tell you that.
Erica has a question.
Oh,
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering if that son decided to get married in the middle of that 21-year process.
yeah.
Do they have to reapply or do they automatically move down?
No,
to
they
the-
automatically move. But here's the part that's a little bit trickier too, is that if the parent becomes a U.S. citizen,
Mhm.
then they just bump up to F1. So now it's 2 months faster, right? Except that he got married, so it's 2 years and 2 years slower,
Yeah.
right? So, so there's a lot of conversations when people call and ask, can my son, he's thinking about getting married, we want, let's look, don't get married, don't become a citizen, like there's a lot of, and that puts parents at risk, right? Because if you're a green card holder, as we learned, suddenly green card holders weren't getting back into the country, right? When they were depending upon what their passport was. So there's a huge risk. People really want to become a U.S. citizen because it's stability. But then they look at their family like, oh, I have to wait, even longer. So then they hold on to their green card instead of naturalizing. That's what becoming a U.S. citizen. So it really makes people vulnerable. Yeah. One more, I'll give you one more. Okay, if you're a U.S. citizen and you want to file for your son who's Filipino, so how long will that take? You're a U.S. citizen and your son is, let's say, unmarried, and your country of origin is the Philippines. How long will that take?
Is that 10 years?
12 years.
Yeah, 12 years. Yeah, that'll take about 12 years. But what if he get married? What if he gets married?
23.
Yeah.
23.
23 years. Yeah. So you go from 12 years to 23 years if your son gets married. Yeah. So this is when this is on the Department of State website. It's updated every month. So in your free time, if you ever want to just peek, like, oh, how long would it take? Oh, look, the U.S. government is now looking at applications from 1995. Wow. So if you ever want to just look at this, it's always there. It's available for the public. But this is, when people say, why don't you just enter lawfully? There's an avenue for you. Why don't you just come in through a green card system? Here's why. Because it's 23 years. So you don't get to see your parents for 23 years. That's why people decide, I can't wait 23 years. That's too long to be away. I'm supporting 2 households. So this is a response to that.
If you're a green card holder and you want to go back to your home country, how long can you stay out?
Yeah, if you can stay out for 6 months out of every 1 calendar year, or out of every year, you can stay out up to 6 months. Yeah, and there are some ways where you could be out longer.
So people might sort of spend that 23 years sort of going back and forth.
If they have the resources to do so, sure. Mm-hmm.
That's taken away from your process of being naturalized. So you're like, you lived here 6 months less, so the 5-year process makes it.
Exactly. So, yeah.
I didn't hear what Abby said.
Go ahead.
No, you
yes,
go
you're
ahead.
a budding immigration lawyer back here. Let's go.
I'm like, it's fine.
So you can stay out of the country for 6 out of every 12 months. If you stay 1 day over that 6 months, then you have to wait an additional year to apply for citizenship, because one of the requirements for citizenship is you have to show that you've been physically present in the U.S. for at least 6 out of the 12 months for 5 consecutive years. So if you were here for 4 years and you traveled in and out less than 6 months for those 4 years, and the last year your daughter got sick and so you went back to your home country for 8 months, then you got to start all over on the, calculating your time. Yeah. Okay, so here's why I'm here today. So here's what we'll talk about. Refugees and asylees. These are 2 terms that are part of the same legal definition, although the way in which people apply for refugee status or asylee status is very different. So I'm going to talk about that. But the definition is the same regardless of whether or not you're a refugee or an asylee. And that definition is that second paragraph on my slide. I'm just going to read it to you because it's complicated. And just a reminder, last year there was an immigration judge who said, I've explained immigration law to a 3-year-old from the bench. They can understand. They don't need a lawyer. They can make their own argument. This is one of the most complicated areas of immigration law, and because each of those bolded terms that I have on that slide is highly litigated. So there's case law, years and years and years of case law about what each of those phrases mean and whether or not somebody's eligible based on that specific phrase. So a refugee is a person, and a refugee or asylee, so saying it's the same legal definition, is a person who's unable or unwilling to return to his or her home country and cannot obtain protection in that country due to past persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So
there's no difference between a refugee and an asylee?
there is a difference. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but the actual definition of who of who's eligible to be a refugee or an asylee is the same. Yeah. So that particular social group that's the last bolded, that's one of the most litigated portions of asylum law. And that's because the particular social group is, sometimes it's not, sometimes people aren't persecuted because of or on account of their race, religion, nationality, or political opinion, but it is because of their particular social group. For example, we know, and this is, hopefully I'm moving into like the actual content of your course here, but we know that in El Salvador, there's a phenomenon called femicide. Women are murdered because they're women. There are more murdered women in El Salvador than in war countries, more than in Syria, simply because they're women. Well, that's not race, religion, nationality, or political opinion, right? So lawyers have had to carve out, okay, this is a social group. These are, because they're women who are in El Salvador, oftentimes without a male figure in the home, they are vulnerable. And we can see, there is data to show that women are murdered simply because they're women in El Salvador. So that has been litigated. The Board of Immigration Appeals has looked at it. Various circuit courts have looked at it. Okay, now it is a social group. So this is, but there wouldn't, very few children could approach the border and say, my mom was murdered because she was a woman, right? They don't know the asylum law or don't know the litigation that's happened around that. So that's just one example. Okay, so the process, just the, kind of the refugee process does take about 18 to 24 months, and that's once someone is identified as a refugee abroad. And so I'm going to talk through that next. But does anyone have questions about this slide? Okay. Here is one of my favorite little visuals for what this looks like. So a refugee is somebody who seeks to the designation of refugee abroad. So a refugee is someone who is fleeing their home country and ends up in a place where they can ask for refugee status abroad, outside of the United States. So that is, refugees go through that process, come through the United Nations. I'm not a part of it. No immigration lawyer is ever a part of it. It's just something that the United Nations is orchestrates that, does the background checks and the screening and determines eligibility. And the United Nations does that for the world. So all of this, the dialogue that we heard during the campaign and, you know, prior to the election and even post-election about, you know, we're letting people in who are unsafe, kind of that, those arguments, those are unfounded because we're not designating refugees. The United Nations, every country in the world has agreed upon these definitions. In the United Nations, not in the world, but all of the countries who are part of the UN have agreed on this definition. And people are applying after they're designated as a refugee, then they can apply to be relocated to Germany, Canada, the US. But there's not like a, let's double check, are you a refugee by our lower standard? No, it's a UN standard. So that's how that process works. Now it is true that we do actually, the United States does go through an even higher level of screening. If somebody says that they do want to come to be relocated to the United States, at that point the Department of State does go through some additional screening. So we actually, our criteria are actually above and beyond that of the UN. So it's just those are facts. Just going to give you some true facts. Okay, so that's how the refugee resettlement process works, and there's a visual for that. But once somebody has been designated a refugee, they do have to wait 18 to 24 months in like a refugee camp. That is, it is monitored, and it is it's all under like the umbrella of the UN, and that's where people live while they wait for their number to come up. Yeah.
I was just wondering, at what age does an individual like go through this process by themselves? Like, is it at age 18 that someone would go through, or like, can they put a child through the same process?
A child can definitely go through the process of being a refugee or an asylee.
Would they go through the same like interview process?
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine it's with like a social worker, right?
Oh, would that be nice?
Yeah.
No. No, they go through it on their own. Yeah. So the kids, the piece that's a little bit different is that there is a different standard for children. So children are the law does say that there is a different standard that the child is afforded than an adult. So there is an understanding that a child may not be able to, that the fear, for example, that a child may have may be disproportionate to an adult's fear. That it's just different because that person's a child. And so there is a different standard. But immigration is, contrary again to what we hear in the news, and these are civil proceedings. They're not criminal proceedings. It's a civil offense to come to the border and cross without documentation. That's a civil offense. And so these are civil proceedings, which means that you are not afforded an attorney at the government's expense. That means children or adults are not afforded. There's no pro bono attorney. So of course children can't afford attorneys. Okay, so the affirmative, and then, so this is how that process works for refugees. The process of an asylee and requesting asylum, that happens when somebody approaches the border. So you can only actually request asylum if you are on U.S. soil. So that's why these are two different processes. And also that's part of the reason why, this, our current status, like what's happening at the southern border is so infuriating, honestly, is because the law says that you're offered the opportunity to seek asylum in the United States. That's what the law says. However, our current administration is saying, no, you may not come on to U.S. soil. You cannot enter and ask for asylum. And so that was part of the family separation, the motive behind the family separation. That's part of the conversation right now with, the negotiations is let's reduce the number of people who can ask for asylum. And that is completely contrary to what Congress intended. Congress intended, and law says that if you're on U.S. soil and you do not feel safe in your home country, you have the right to ask for asylum. So this is the only way you can ask for asylum. You can't ask for asylum from Mexico. The law doesn't allow it. You can't ask for asylum from El Salvador. You have to be on U.S. soil. So by not allowing people in, then it's an affirmative denial of the ability to request safety. So there are two ways, two processes for asylum. One is somebody may come to the United States as a tourist or as a student, and after entering could ask affirmatively, I'm in status, I'm already here, I'm not in removal proceedings, but I would like to ask for asylum. And that's called the affirmative asylum process. And that process is one that is long, and it also is before an immigration officer, an asylum officer. So rather than going before a court, if it's an affirmative process and you're sending an application to USCIS, to the asylum office, then you will be interviewed by an asylum officer. The defensive avenue is when somebody approaches the border, asks for asylum. They're immediately put into removal proceedings. So they are, their biometrics are captured. They're given a court date. They're told that they have to appear at the court date. They're told that they're in removal proceedings and that they will be removed from the United States unless they can articulate their fear. And they have what's called a credible fear interview, and it's determined whether or not that person has a credible fear. If the asylum officer determines that there's no credible fear, then there's no hearing. That person's just removed. If the asylum officer determines, okay, I think there may be a credible fear, then they're given a court date. So when we had all of the children approaching the southern border in 2014, we had the mass, kind of the crisis of children fleeing the triangle countries. Children were being detained, and children were given these interviews, and oftentimes the credible fear was denied because, again, these were children, they were interviewed without a parent, and they were supposed to articulate their fear, and so then they were put into removal proceedings and they were removed without, a full hearing or an opportunity to talk to an attorney. So there have been lots of efforts to change that process so that children have access to an attorney, that they're not detained for unreasonable amounts of time, which they were at that time. There's some litigation around that, so now that children can't be detained for more than 48 hours. So that the process is constantly changing because of the litigation around it. But there's a lot to unpack with that defensive process, and I'll do that a little bit more here. So just a quick kind of overview about what happens at the border. I did talk about this already a little bit. But just as, I think it's important to know that when people come to the border, if they ask for asylum, they're not just permitted in to the country. They are immediately put into removal proceedings. So there's immediately an affirmative action against them to remove them from the United States. And there's a duty, or the challenge is for that person to make their argument, to make their claim as to why they're eligible for asylum. And by eligible, all those bolded components that I shared with you. So the first thing that happens is that somebody, when they approach the border, and so actually, this is a pretty condensed version. I worked at the border in 2014, and I worked with kids and moms who were approaching the border just outside of San Antonio at a detention center there called Dilley. And so what, you know, I spent a long time every day hearing the stories from moms and kids about, you know, what their actual experience was. So what their actual experience was is that they come to the border, they're looking for an officer, a border patrol officer. Like, they want to be found. I'm here, I would like asylum. And so the border patrol officer detains them. People are put into, you know, one of those trucks, and then they're transported to the translation from Spanish is a ice box. So for up to 2 days, the moms and kids said that they sat on the floor of this. It sounded like a refrigerated box. That's the size of, like, it's 12 by 12, kind of a small box. The lights are like blaring. They keep the lights on all day and all night. And the kids are given a cheese sandwich and water. So they sit there for 24 to 48 hours. It's not clear why. Some people were there a little less time. I almost seemed like they wait until there are enough people to then transport them to detention, but I'm not sure.
And why is it so cold?
I don't know. It's so hard to know. But it was, every single person I talked to just said it was awful, that it was just so cold. They were freezing. There's a lot of, like, when people get to the detention center, they're immediately, like, bathed and given all, pumped full of vaccines and given all sorts of, like, treatment for, like lice and all sorts of other things. And so, one of the theories was maybe it's so cold, they were hoping that, that bacteria would die. I don't know. There were just there's so many theories, but nobody could figure out why. So but that's the first step. And then people are transported to this detention center that is a federal prison. So it was the immigration took over kind of it's a federal prison, and it's also staffed by federal prison employees. The GEO group is a group that they contract with federal prisons and with detention centers. So not like the kindest, warmest souls there. And so then people go through, once they're at the detention center and they get all those vaccines, and they're put into these jumpsuits, and they wear different colors depending upon whether or not they've committed crimes or anything like that. And then they're given a credible fear interview. And the children, everybody is permitted an attorney, but they're not given an attorney. And so what we did is we sort of like set up, there's a collaborative group of lawyers. One of the groups that I'm part of is the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And so AILA, it's called, and two other groups put a bunch of funding together and housed lawyers at the detention center. And so we're just constantly tracking. When people came in, we would talk to them and meet with them and try to prep them for this credible fear interview, and then attend those interviews with the child or the parent. Like I said early on, in some cases the parent was in the interview with all of her children as well. And then we learned later that in a lot of those cases, the credible fear was a negative finding, meaning there was no credible fear, and so they were put into removal proceedings. But as we learned after talking to the parents, that mothers didn't want to share, why they fled in front of their young children. So of course, there was no credible fear finding, right? And so that was, again, some more lawsuits and education of, asylum officers. Like, you can't do this. You can't put moms with their kids and ask them to talk about their DV experience, right? Or what was the threats that were coming against their kids. That they're not going to do that. So that shifted, and so now then we saw that there were more and more women who were willing to talk about their fear when their children weren't present. So if there is a credible fear finding, then that person's immediately, there's an immigration court actually in the detention center, and so I would go with my client to court, and the judge would be streamed onto a screen like this. We sit at a little table, it's all in the detention center, and make an argument for bond. So that means, if there's a credible fear, then the government says, okay, you can have a hearing, but the hearings right now, the asylum hearings, are backlogged 3 to 4 years. So that would mean that woman and her children would need to stay in detention for 3 to 4 years to wait for their hearing.
Oh.
So the first thing that we do is we ask for bond. Well, this person's had no criminal history. This person has a family member who lives in Seattle. This person has, talk about why this person should be able to leave. And most of the time, in those cases, when there are young children especially, the judge would say, yes, you can leave, pay a bond of $10,000 to $15,000, and they would put an ankle bracelet on the woman, and so she would be monitored all day, every day by ICE, and she would have to do check-ins and come back for a hearing. So again, this is not a criminal proceeding, but it feels very much like a criminal proceeding. So many people have said it's so hard to find work. I have this thing on my ankle, And then for a while, the only way to recharge it was that you had to plug it in, and so they're holding their leg up, next to this outlet, and it burns their ankle because it's just the heat from the electrical current. So, again, it's just asking for asylum is, it's a process that doesn't afford someone much dignity. So that's the defensive process.
So is it, where do they get the money, or how do you arrange the bond?
Yeah, the family, the hope is that family members can come up with the money. So if there are family members in the United States, then that's oftentimes how people will come up with the bond. I do know that there are some organizations that will, collect donations too, but it's a very big barrier. Sometimes people, that's a lot of money, $10,000 to $15,000. Yes.
So, in what situations are children and their parents kept in the same detention center? Because I was at a panel just last week talking about a detention center, or a detainment center, in near here, Seattle.
Yeah.
And there were no children at that center. So, could you just clarify when children are kept with their families or when they're separated?
Well, because of the agreement that I referenced a while ago, children can't be detained for more than 48 hours. So the parents may be detained, and this is the part of the family separation, is that maybe a mom or a dad is in detention, and then the child is actually sent off to HHR, Office for Refugee Resettlement. They're sent off to a foster care facility, essentially. Immigration lawyers have filed lots of lawsuits, and that too because somebody's ability to request asylum plummets significantly when they're separated from their family. Because oftentimes, it may be that it's the mom who has the claim, but the whole family journeyed together. And suddenly the father is in LA and the mother's in Boston and the children are in Chicago. How can the child and the father articulate the mom's claim? They can't. So just linking those cases it seems like it should be easy, but with that family separation chaos, parents were deported before they realized, oh, shoot, you're supposed to be with that other person. So yeah, it's a big problem. But there aren't detention facilities for children. There are family detention centers, and in those, that's Dilley, where I was, and there's another one in Carnes. There are only 3 in the whole country. And those, again, the turnaround, like if those kids are there for more than 48 hours, then we're filing lawsuits. So they're it's children. Right. If they turn 18, then they're an adult. Yeah.
I think you said asylees are not afforded an attorney.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your job in the detention center? And
Pro bono.
okay.
Yeah. I mean, we're anytime that we're working with folks before immigration court in those settings, yeah, it's all pro bono.
How many people do you think are sort of in this period of on a bond that breaks the waiting?
Yeah,
Any
I'm going to
information?
tell you that actually. Yes, 800,000 right now. People who are waiting for their immigration court hearing because of the shutdown. So here you can see on my little chart, in March of 2018, March of last year, there were 690,000 open deportation cases before the immigration court. Since the shutdown, we're at over 800,000 because no courts are open right now. So for 4 days. And remember, they're like super short hearings, so the judges will hear so many a day. All these people, and they've waited maybe 3 or 4 years, and now they're actually put to the bottom of the list. Yeah, because all those other hearings are scheduled, so they'll go on as scheduled, but all these people who have been canceled go back to the bottom. It's hard to not. Yeah.
What is the access like to healthcare, mental health care, women's?
That's such a good question. Is there access to healthcare or mental health care in the detention center? In theory, there is. So at the family detention center in Dilley, one of the things that we were hearing again and again is that kids were just getting water and mothers. I met with one woman who she was from Honduras, and she fled her abuser, and she described she was in her home and her abuser was coming at her with a weapon, and she jumped through a window, and when she jumped through the window, she broke the glass, and she had just a gaping cut on her back from the glass. And she had 4 kids. The only kid nearby was her youngest, her 4-year-old. She grabbed her 4-year-old and just waited. She said she never looked back. She didn't collect anything. She just went. She just knew. She'd been thinking about it for a while, but she just knew that there was no safe place for her. She walked to the southern border with this 4-year-old and that, gaping wound on her back. And she showed it to me. She had made the whole entire trek, and nobody would give her. She said, I keep asking, it hurts so much. They're giving me water. They're just telling me to drink water. So, we're told that yes, we have doctors here, yes, we have, but I think that the reality is that it's very hard to get proper medical care. And you maybe heard about the detainee at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, who recently died in detention. There are lots of arguments that he should have been afforded a therapist, and wasn't. So we are able to get mental health providers into the detention center for evaluation purposes. So we do, often it's really important for somebody's case to show the effects of past trauma, to get diagnostic information, and so there are mental health providers who are permitted for that purpose. But again, the government doesn't offer therapy at the expense of the government. These are all things that are paid for by the family members. Yeah. But general health care is supposed to be provided. Yeah. Okay, so here are some numbers. Just 1 out of 3 asylum applications are denied. So it's a very that's a high denial rate. Not everybody who requests asylum is granted asylum. As of March, like I said, there's a 4-year wait for affirmative applications. So that's really hard because people who
So I'm not sure, so you've got 20,000 granted asylum, and then you broke it down between affirmative and defensive. What's the difference there?
Yeah, so affirmative is for people who were not in detention. People who came to the United States like on a visa, tourist visa, or student visa, or work visa, and then later asked for asylum. And then, kind of lived and worked in their community while waiting for their interview. And the defensive, many of those people are either in detention, are checking in, have, monthly or quarterly check-ins, that sort of thing.
Those came the Border Patrol.
Right, yeah.
And now, I read somewhere, go back, that it's the denial rate the person who's making that decision is some local judge. Is that right?
So depending on how somebody is asking for asylum, so the affirmative cases, those, our office is the San Francisco Asylum Office, and so we have asylum officers. These are specially trained officers who only hear asylum cases. So because of the sensitivity of the type of application, and because for lots of different reasons, because it's such a complicated area of law, it's one of it's the only application where somebody is afforded a specific officer, trained officer. So if you're applying for anything else, you're going to get like a general USCIS officer. But for asylum, you are afforded a specially trained officer. And I just I think that I'm an immigration lawyer. My opponent, I oppose the government, right? Like this is my posture is to be critical of the government. That's just my job, right? But when our current president was elected and instituted all of these new policies, especially around asylum, there was a huge outcry from the asylum officers. And to me, that's just amazing. That the asylum officers who hear these claims every day were just devastated. They were the ones who were shedding tears and standing up and saying, "This is not okay. These are people who need protection," right? So I think that it's powerful that the people who are given the opportunity, they really are to ask affirmatively for asylum. They really are often before somebody who cares deeply about hearing that person's story. In contrast, immigration judges hear the defensive cases, and the immigration judges hear all defensive cases, so not just asylum. They're also hearing what's called cancellation of removal, cancellation something called CAT. They're hearing, different cases that are not asylum based, and so they're not specialists in the same way. So it's a
So they're local ones.
and they are we have an immigration court in Seattle. It's on 2nd Avenue in the federal building. So there's an immigration court in Seattle. There are immigration courts in the detention center at Tacoma, and then there is an immigration court in Portland. So there are some. They're not in every town or every city, but for us, we have one right here in Seattle.
So the priests who went down to the border in San Antonio, they said that these were the defensive
Yep.
requests.
Mm-hmm.
And they said that the judge down there was denying 95%
Yes.
of
Yeah.
those cases.
Yes, and this is what we've learned is that, you could be in Seattle and there's one judge maybe who denies 30%, but the judge next door denies 80%. It's the same law, maybe even the same claim, but the judges are expected to deny a certain percentage of their cases. They're like quotas for decisions. So it begs the question of what's a fair hearing, right?
And these judges are appointed by the federal.
Yes, they are. So, and the other thing that's interesting about the immigration court is that the immigration court falls under the executive branch. So that's just, we're used to having courts fall under the judiciary branch, right? But immigration courts do not fall under the judiciary branch. They are under the executive branch. So the president is overseeing the immigration courts, not the judiciary. Okay, just, for a point of interest, total number of asylum grants by country. This is way back in 2016, but it's, doesn't change a whole lot, but you can see, so here, you can see Iraq and Syria. I bet those numbers increased quite a bit in 2017 and 2018. So really the asylum grants, you can follow trends, right, of war-torn countries and see, who's asking for asylum and what countries do we see a large number of asylees coming from. So you can typically, so this is what I was talking about before. How's the government shutdown impacting asylum seekers? That's the same immigration judge that I quoted from, I shared her quote from the beginning. She says that it has a devastating effect on asylum seekers. So here's, as of this week, 86,000 cases have been canceled. Well, not canceled, but they'll be rescheduled. Yeah.
And these 2 weeks is that
3 to 4 years. Yeah, these are part of the defensive process. So it's possible, like I said, that people who have been waiting 3 to 4 years will have an additional 3 to 4 years if their hearing was, during the shutdown. So active case backlogs as of November, 809,000. Yeah, so a lot more now when you look at all of the. Oh yes.
So we're calling some of them affirmative
Yeah.
cases and some defensive. Then what do we call illegal immigrants? I mean, if it's legal for someone seeking asylum to come onto the U.S. country, and then apply for a defensive hearing, then those are not illegal immigrants. They follow the law. So what do we call illegal immigrants? People that never.
I encourage you to not call anyone illegal. I mean, that's just high
I mean,
position.
People in the government and stuff call it.
Right.
So what are they
Yeah.
classifying someone
Yeah.
who's like never told any border patrol
Yeah.
that
I
they
think
are
that
here?
I think that our current administration is lumping people who are asylum seekers but not yet asylees as illegal because they're not yet with status. I mean, there are a couple of different approaches. I mean, I think there are some people who are not actively seeking to regularize their status. So people who do not currently have a case before immigration court or do not currently have a visa are people without documentation. So there is a subset of people who live in the United States without documentation and who are not, in some sort of proceeding or not affirmatively seeking. So that, I'm sure that that's part of, this generalization, the category that some of our government is referencing. But the government is also referencing all of those people who are in removal proceedings and are seeking to regularize their status through that proceeding.
So when they've gone through status or they have a visa or something, or they have a student visa maybe or something, and then that expires, and they don't leave the country, then that's what you're saying is people that are undocumented.
Who are without, their documentation has lapsed, or they are without documentation. Yeah, and it doesn't mean, in those cases, it doesn't mean that somebody doesn't have access to status, but it may mean that they haven't, they don't know, they haven't talked to an attorney, they don't know that they could have requested a family-based visa or asylum, or there's a visa for people who've been victims of crime, and maybe they don't know that that's available to them. And so again, just because somebody's status has lapsed or because they may not have status currently doesn't mean that they're not eligible for status.
So can I ask about that process then? If someone here is here undocumented and gets caught, say, are they able then to immediately, once caught, say I'm seeking asylum, or then say I want some sort of court hearing to become documented?
So for somebody if somebody is picked up by ICE, is what we say, and they have been living in the United States without a visa. If they have been living in the United States without a visa for 3 or more years, then they are afforded the opportunity for a hearing, and they can ask for the opportunity to request relief before an immigration judge. They will definitely have to do that before a judge. They can't do that affirmatively. They can't go through the affirmative route. For somebody who has been in the United States for less than 3 years, then they are not afforded the opportunity to request permission to remain in the U.S. and they're what's called expeditedly removed. So, it's
The plane.
just sent back to their home country. And they, part of the, that is most common within a certain number of miles. I think it's 50 miles north or south of the border. So south of the U.S. Canadian border, 50 miles north of the U.S.-Mexico border. There's no opportunity for a hearing. It's just an expedited removal.
And how does ICE track people down?
That's a good question. Facebook, social media, the easiest way, I don't think they work super hard. But I do think that they, think of all the low-hanging fruit, right? Someone's arrested, their name's going to show up in a court docket. Easy peasy, show up at court, we're going to walk you out, some social media stuff. I mean, people claim that they have called and given tips. They'll take tips from neighbors. But I think the easiest and most consistent way that I have seen people who have otherwise been living in the U.S. is they're somebody's been arrested or been pulled over. We don't for a long time we had issues with like racial profiling. People ask, getting pulled over for a headlight out, now where's your ID, show me your green card. That is, no, you cannot do that anymore. So that's not an issue, but it certainly was, yeah. Yes?
For children that were born in the U.S. to undocumented parents or parents that haven't received documentation, are they considered United States citizens because they were born in the country?
U.S., the kids who were born in the U.S. Yes. That was also something that our president attempted to attack, right? Maybe 3 months ago. He wanted to deny citizenship by birthright, right? But as of right now, if a child is born in the United States, they are automatically a U.S. citizen. Yeah. There are lots of countries, it's not just the United States, lots of countries that afford birthright citizenship. Yeah.
With the birthright citizenship, if like the kid like gets older, how does that affect like family-based visas? Like would that expedite the parents being able, the undocumented parents being able to get visas if their child is a birthright citizen?
Sometimes. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on criminal history, immigration history, length of time in the U.S., how somebody got to the U.S. So maybe is the best answer. But it really depends on the situation of those parents who don't have documentation.
You've only got 10 minutes before you've got to leave.
Yeah.
I was going to say, could you maybe share with the students how they could do something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, I'll take this question then.
Yeah.
If someone makes bond and they're released and given a court date, you mentioned work. Are they able to find work at
Yeah.
that point? I know visas can be an issue.
Yeah, good question. So if you affirmatively request asylum, and I was going to talk about this, you have to wait 150 days for filing that. You're segueing me into the next slide. 150 days before you file that, before you can ask for work authorization. Right now it's taking 3 to 6 months to get work authorization from the time of filing. So you could be unemployed for a year and have a valid asylum claim. That is, again and again for my clients, that is the hardest year. So to live in the United States and you can't work and they don't want to break the law, but they're, talk about vulnerability. People are surfing on couch surfing, and those are hard days. And then because of funding, like Refugee Women's Alliance, none of these asylum organizations will give you money if you're just an asylum seeker. You have to be granted asylum before you can get job training or child care, any housing, any of those things. So it is a big people. For people who have the court process, you can use that notice to appear. You can use that you have an upcoming hearing as the basis for a request for work authorization. But again, you have to wait. Just because you can ask for it, the process, because we're so backlogged, it takes a long time to get that work authorization. This is just some information about unaccompanied minors. This is what I care deeply about. Most of my work is actually with unaccompanied minors, with children. We're in a crisis. So we have more children who are mobile, traveling across the world without an adult than ever before because of war, because of violence, for lots of different reasons. And so you can just see the numbers are escalating, 70,000 just at the U.S. border in 2014 alone. So more information about that. The UN Children's Fund has said that this is a crisis, and the numbers that we're seeing, they believe, are just the tip of the iceberg, because as you can imagine, when children travel alone, they often don't make it. The dangers: exploitation, violence, detention, lack of healthcare and education, and separation from family. Trafficking is a big problem. It's called forced migration, when children have to leave their home because of violence and war. I'm going to leave this. You'll have these slides, but I'm just going to. So I tried to link this to some health implications. We've talked about all of these things. the most concerning implications are, just, of course, whether or not a child has access to the process to even be afforded a hearing or even be afforded the relief that they deserve, in my mind. So that means, are there attorneys available pro bono to work with these kids and to walk them through the process? These kids come to the United States, they're put immediately into foster care, and then they're looking for family members or for somebody around the country to take them in. So that's their first experience after a journey to the United States. And these are kids who come from trauma. So there are, most of my kids have never seen a doctor. They're between the ages of 13 and 21. And they've never been to a doctor. So that's just a basic, health concern. But then the additional hurdle of, just the mental health and the working through trauma and working through leaving family, that sort of thing. So these are some of the ways in which immigration has been impacted by our current administration. I'm not going to go through it too much, but just this is somebody's question from the very beginning. The refugee, our current administration has reduced the number of refugees that will be admitted to 30,000 for the fiscal year 2019. And you can see the numbers under previous administrations. So in 1980, 230 refugees per fiscal year were admitted into our country. And now, for this year, it will be 30,000. Under the George H.W. Bush, so another Republican, 125 to 142,000. So this is so low. It's unprecedented. The numbers and kind of the posture that this administration is taking is unprecedented. And here are some resources for you if you're interested in helping. Immediately, we have a Citizenship Day, and that's on February 2nd here in Seattle. It's actually at SeaTac Airport. If you're interested in volunteering, it's a 4-hour event. It's so amazing. It's like one of my favorite things that I do every year is these Citizenship Days, because you are coming along somebody who maybe started as a refugee, and this is their final step. And the other thing that's exciting about this is that this is probably the last Citizenship Day that we'll have here in this Western Washington before the next election. So we'll have lots of other Citizenship Days, but in order for someone to actually get their interview in time to be able to vote for the next presidential election, this is the day. So
you just show up at CPAC?
You can go to the One America website and register to volunteer. They need interpreters, just people to fill out forms, childcare, whatever. If you're open to doing that, it's a really great experience. KIND is Kids in Need of Defense. They're always looking for help. Most of the work that they do all the hands-on direct representation of kids who are in removal proceedings. So they work with kids. You're not lawyers, but there are lots of other ways that you can get involved. But that's a really great organization, and I recommend that. In terms of more long-term working with people who are here and seeking services, the rest of those organizations on that list would be great references for you. So, and then I have my card up here. I'll leave it up here.
You're available by email.
And I am available by email. You're always welcome to reach out to me if you have questions. Feel free. I love talking with SPU students. So if you have just a question, feel free to send me an email or give me a call. My office is in Seattle, so it's easy for me to get over here too. Okay. All right.